Hi, my name is Tristan Mentry. I am the program's coordinator here at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History and Sea Center. And again, welcome to Science Pub. So this is Dr. John Johnson. He has served as curator of anthropology at the Santa Barbara Museum of Natural History for 35 years. He received his Ph.D. in anthropology at UCSB in 1988. For 17 years, he has taught an annual course on California Indians at UCSB, where he holds an appointment as adjunct professor of anthropology. Dr. Johnson's written contributions include more than 100 studies regarding the culture, history, and prehistory of California's native peoples, especially emphasizing the Chumash Indians of the Santa Barbara region. So without further ado, here's John.
Thank you, Tristan. Before I begin, I just wanted to acknowledge the fact that this presentation is taking place in the ancestral territory of the Barbareño Chumash people. And in general, a lot of what I'm going to be talking about this evening pertains to Chumash cultural heritage generally. What I'm going to be talking about this evening is some of the very earliest archaeology that was accomplished here in the Santa Barbara region. And in particular, I'm going to talk about Stephen Bowers. And Bowers, as we will learn, is a very unique and complicated character, but also along the way made some important scientific contributions. And so this is a photograph that was taken is in our Bowers collections here at the museum that shows Bowers, and I think that may be his son, camping out in the desert during one of their expeditions, and probably in the late 19th century. So Stephen Bowers began his career in Indiana, where he was born, raised on a farm there near Wilmington, Indiana. He decided to enter the priesthood. And so he took in 1855, when he was 23 years old, he took his vows as a Methodist minister. And just shortly thereafter, he married his first wife, Martha Craycroft, and served as a pastor in various churches in the Midwest, and then began service as a chaplain during the Civil War for the 67th Indiana Infantry. After the war was over, he got his bachelor's degree from Indiana University, and he became, and in his studies, he became quite interested in the sciences, especially geology. He had, after graduating, he had ministries in various locations, Kentucky, Oregon, Napa, and then because of his wife's poor health, he was able to get a position as a minister in the First United Methodist Church in Santa Barbara. And so this is what Santa Barbara looked like in the 1870s when Bowers arrived. These are some early photographs that were taken by the very first photographers that had set up a photographic studio in Santa Barbara, Hayward and Musal. So this is what Santa Barbara looked like in the 1870s. And this is the church that where Bowers was minister. And he served there for about 3 years, from 1874 to 1877. And his first foray into archaeology, at least in local archaeology, we have a clue from the Santa Barbara newspaper from March 10th, 1875, where it mentions that Bowers, I understand that he was on a walk with his wife on the beach and near Moore Mesa. And he saw that they were doing some excavations at an artesian well. And there was an archaeological site there, and he picked up a very beautiful stone knife at that location. It was such a remarkable find that the Santa Barbara newspaper ran this article about it. Now, I don't know that one of these knives might be that knife. They're certainly probably like the one that he found, but these are ones that are in Bowers' collection at the Smithsonian Institution. So Bowers was, just a few months later after that discovery in March, an expedition arrived. The exploring expedition, the Wheeler expedition, came to Santa Barbara. It had a botanist and archaeologists, and there was also a linguist who collected some Indian vocabularies from the local Chumash. And Bowers met them and took them out to the location where on Moore Mesa, where he'd found that knife. And while they were excavating at that site, the botanist wandered across to what we know today as Muscalatin Island. And there he came back and said, hey, there's a lot of indications of a large village site and over here. And they went over and undertook the excavations at Muscalatin Island, which they referred to kind of as the Big Bonanza. And Bowers became then the field director for the excavations at Muscalatin Island. And subsequently, they went up the coast and excavated also at Dos Pueblos Canyon. Well, Bowers got really excited about the possibilities of archaeology, and this kind of launched him on another career as an archaeologist, or an early pioneer in archaeology, you might say. And he wrote to the Smithsonian, to Spencer Baird, who was head of the Smithsonian, and began over the next several years, in fact, the next 29 years, he began a relationship with the Smithsonian Institution. And for example, here is the annual report for the year 1877, which, in which it states, the largest additions from any one source has resulted from the continued explorations of the Reverend Stephen Bowers on the mainland in the vicinity of Santa Barbara and on the adjacent islands of Southern California. Over 40 boxes of material alone have been supplied by him. And the Smithsonian, all told, has 16 different accessions that are attributed to Bowers, not only of artifacts, but also fossils, because he was also interested in geology and paleontology. And these come from the Midwest as well as California, but most of these accessions come from his work in the Santa Barbara area, the Chumash region. He published an article in that same volume of the annual report of the Smithsonian on his expedition to Santa Rosa Island, where he talked not only about his archaeological work, but also about the geology and paleontology of the island as well. And the photo there is a picture of Bowers at Cueva Valdez on Santa Cruz Island. Now, Bowers wasn't alone among these early investigators. We have, here's three of them whose careers I've studied to a certain extent. And Lorenzo Yates on the left was a companion of Bowers. He was along on that expedition to Santa Rosa Island, for example. And the two of them were among the founders of the Santa Barbara Natural History Society in the 1870s, which was a forerunner of our Museum of Natural History in Santa Barbara today. Paul Schumacher was a Hungarian archaeologist who came to California in 1874 and did some excavations in this area, in the San Luis Obispo area, and also worked with Bowers during that Wheeler expedition in 1875. And then a French anthropologist, archaeologist, and geologist, Léon de Sézac, was a third person. Bowers was felt quite competitive with Léon de Sézac. Sézac went to Santa Cruz Island and did excavations, and Bowers felt that, and his collections ended up back in Paris, and Bowers felt that that was wrong, that the collections should stay in this country. And so he kind of agitated against Sézac. Well, one of the things that really sets Bowers' work apart from some of the others is we actually have Bauer's journals. And he kept a series of notebooks in which he drew maps and kept detailed descriptions of where he was going and the different archaeological sites where he worked. Now, these journals have been edited and published in a book called The Noontide Sun by Arlene Benson, who also wrote several chapters setting Bauer's work in sort of the context of the time. And we have the original journals here at the Museum of Natural History in our anthropology department. Also, we have a series of drawings that were made by Bauer's, including the very first depictions known to exist of the paintings up at Painted Cave. And these are Bauer's sketches of those paintings. Unfortunately, he didn't draw them in respect to the way they appear in the cave. He kind of treated each symbol individually and put it on the page in that way. But it's the very first attempt at documenting the paintings at Painted Cave. And the Bauers also went to the local photographic studio, the Hayward and Muzal photo gallery, which existed. This is what State Street looked like in the 1870s. And there he had photographs made of his some of the artifacts that he'd been excavating from sites. Especially, these photos apparently were made in 1875 because Neil Graffey pointed out to me he found an article in the Santa Barbara Daily Press from September in 1875 saying that Hayward and Muzal had taken stereoscopic views of a number of the finest archaeological implements discovered by Mr. Bowers in this county. And these apparently are those photos, or a couple of the photos from those stereo pairs that Hayward and Muzal produced. And now we can ask the question, what became of these collections? All those boxes that were shipped to the Smithsonian and elsewhere. And we know that some of them were sold to East Coast museums, not only the Smithsonian, but also to other museums, as we'll learn, and also to some private collectors as well. And from there, specimens regarded as duplicates were then traded and dispersed elsewhere. So actually, there are European museums that have Bauer's collections because they were parts of trades made by the Smithsonian to other internationally to other museums. And this in those days, that was a common practice, not so much anymore. Now these existing collections where they exist are useful for material culture studies. And if the site provenience could be established, these collections will become more valuable from a research standpoint as an anthropologist or an archaeologist. Well, I became involved in studying Bauer's work in the Santa Barbara region back when I was a graduate student in anthropology at UC Santa Barbara. And about that time, Bauer's journals had come to light. They were discovered in a trunk in a garage in Simi Valley. And Arlene Benson, who was working on her master's thesis at Northridge, lived across the street from the person whose house had these journals. And that person was Arthur Harrington, the nephew of the anthropologist John Harrington. John Harrington had borrowed the Bauer's journals and had his nephew, this is back in the 1930s, had his nephew typing up the journals, had hired his nephew to do that. And the nephew had kept these in a trunk ever since. And so Arlene then decided that she would make it her master's thesis project to study the journals. And she came to the university where I was, and I knew a lot of the areas that Bowers was describing in his journals, because many of them were in the Santa Ynez Mountains and the San Rafael Mountains. And so I worked with Arlene to kind of identify where he had been going. And later on, I had an opportunity to go to the Smithsonian and study the collections. So the research that I've kept up over the years has been to locate these sites that were excavated by Bowers, to compare the features on his maps with what is visible today, to identify his collections in the East Coast museums, to look at the correspondence and shipping records, and to determine the likely site provenience for artifacts and clues in his journals. When we can tell, we know from his journals when he was at a particular location, and then we can look at the shipping records and see when he shipped from soon thereafter, and we can kind of piece together which areas those artifacts may have come from. Well, it turns out that Bowers got all over Santa Barbara County during these years between 1875 and 1879. And here's a map showing the locations of the Chumash villages. These are villages that we know were occupied up until the time of the missions. These are ones that have names in the mission records. And every one that I've circled here is a place where Bowers went and excavated. So we know he was working at sites that had recently been occupied. In the 1870s, that maybe 70 years earlier, there had been people living at these places. So he had the capability of seeing features at these locations that now are invisible today. But here's an example. Here's a rancheria or a village called Sawaya. And Sawaya is located on Los Padres National Forest. It has an archaeological site number. And there is Bowers' map showing that location. And you can see he shows a sweat lodge. So there's still visible a depression on this site where the Temescal or the sweat lodge was located. And this is my map that I made in 1985, following up on Bowers' journals to record the same site. We could no longer see the sweat lodge, but we could map the extent of the location of that village. We also, here's a map showing the village of Shnahalyowa. And Shnahalyowa is later on gave its name to a land grant on the upper Santa Ynez River called the Nahalayegua land grant. Nahalayegua is sort of a Hispanicization of the original Chumash name. And this is Bowers' map shown on the left. And one of the interesting things on this map is he shows house depressions and a sweat lodge. So he's showing where people were living, or at least where several house depressions were still visible, and where the sweat lodge was located. And then he also shows a cabin where he stayed called a Brockenbauer's cabin. And there you can see that cabin on the map. So I went back with this map in my hands, and sure enough, here's the site, and there is Brockenbauer's cabin. You can still see the foundations of it there, where Bowers stayed back in, I think it was 1877 or 1878. So here's another site as documented by Bowers. This one is also on Los Padres Forest, and it is called Schneewach is the name of it. And we think that it is this village. And here again, he's showing features at this location. He shows a sweat lodge off here to the left. He shows what he describes as a rock enclosure. Here's some circular house depressions over here. And so the Forest Service has since done some test excavations at this location. And we were unable to detect the sweat lodge at all, but I think they did document at least one of these house depressions. Here's another description of a village. This is Rincon, the village of Rincon or Shuku. And on the left, you see the Coast Survey map from 1869. And then just, 9 years later, we have Bauer's map showing the locations of where he saw evidence of middens, of archaeological sites where the Indians had been living. And this is another village. This is the ethnohistoric rancheria of Tequepch, which is on the middle San Ynez River. And here's Bauer's map shown here. And this is an aerial photo. Now let's go back for a minute. And you can see here, Bauer's map shows a large, what looks like a large D shown on this map, which he considered to have been man-made. Now, this is an aerial photograph, and what you'll notice in this is from 1928, and what you'll notice here, there is the D that is shown on Bauer's map. It's still visible from an aerial photograph in 1928. And this was the original road that Bauer's shows, and then this was the road as it then existed in 1928. Well, this is the road here that existed in 1928. This is the original road. Okay, so today, that location is underneath Lake Cachuma. But a few years ago, when we had a drought, I went back out to this. The lake level was low enough that you could go out there and walk around. And what we determined was that actually that D is still visible, but it's really an old terrace that has been exposed. It's not really man-made, and sort of lag deposits from the river. And so Bowers was not accurate there in stating that was man-made. However, who knows? Maybe it was an enclosure that the Indians used, but it was an enclosure, a feature that was made by nature, not by human hands. So over the years, as I've said, I've tried to visit the different sites where Bowers documented and made maps. But then I've also been to the Smithsonian, and what I've tried to do is go back and look at the original catalog ledgers that where Bowers artifacts were documented, and that when he shipped them to the Smithsonian, the original catalog records. And here I am looking at some of those books back in about 13 years ago. And here is an example of some of the Bowers collections at the Smithsonian's National Museum of Natural History. What's interesting is there are things here that today would be impossible to find in these collections. For example, that's a soap root brush that was excavated from one of the sites, still hadn't deteriorated away. That's part of the Bowers collection. And then in the lower right, you'll see there's a knife that still has its wooden handle. It's still preserved and hafted to it. These might have been discoverable back in the 1870s, but today the wood would have been all rotted away by now. So there are some rather unique pieces in these collections, and some of them we can identify where they came from. Here's some of the stone implements collected by Bowers, stone knives, and that really interesting piece in the middle is obsidian with serrated edge all the way around. This we know from his journals. We're able to, because he sketched it. He was so interested by this particular artifact. He sketched it. It came from one of the archaeological sites from the village of Kalahwashak in the San Ynez Valley. So I've also been to the American Museum of Natural History in New York, and there's a collection there called the Terry Collection at that museum. And Terry got some of his artifacts purchased them from Bowers, but also some of the people who were working with Bowers. And so this is a photograph of those things that was sent to Terry before he purchased them. And these pieces today are identifiable in the collections there at the American Museum of Natural History. on the left, you can see the catalog of items that were shipped to Terry. This is Terry's notations. Now, Bowers wrote to Terry in 1878 that he has learned of a burial place on the headwaters of the Sisquoc River. And he states that old Chief Sisquoc was buried there. Now, there's no such person as old Chief Sisquoc. So I don't know whether someone has kind of pulling Bowers' leg or whether Bowers himself made this up. But that would be unusual maybe for a Methodist minister, or whether his imagination just ran away with him. And anyway, he sent this note to Terry about Chief Sisquoc's grave. And I eventually was able to visit this location. This is my site map of where he said Chief Sisquoc was buried. This is in July 1879 is when he did his excavation on the Sisquoc. But he didn't end up selling those artifacts to Terry at the American Museum. Instead, they went to the Yale's Peabody Museum. So here's the collection, part of the Bowers sent to the Peabody Museum. You can see there's eagle claws, there's lots of shell beads on the left and shell ornaments. And then on the right, there's a couple of very interesting specimens. And one of them is on the upper right, is an arrow point. And this one would be, we know that this is actually maybe as old as 7,000 years or earlier, and probably was not found on the Sisquoc River. This probably came from San Miguel Island. And we call those the Channel Islands Barbed points. And we know that they're quite early in the chronological sequence here in the Santa Barbara region. And on the lower right is a very interesting bead. It has actually serpentine, made us serpentinite, and you can see there's a carving of what looks like a fern leaf or something on the surface of the bead. Very unusual. And when you study this collection, you realize Bowers was shipping it to them, and they have it cataloged as all coming from Sisquoc's grave. Well, these artifacts are from when you look at the beads and look at the types of beads, they're coming from different time periods, and they're obviously a mix of different collections. They aren't all coming from that site on the upper Sisquoc River. So there's either confusion in the catalog, or else, Bowers was not being entirely honest where everything came from. More research needs to be done to kind of straighten that out. Anyway, when Bowers got back that October, just a few months after he was on the Sisquoc River, his first wife, Martha, died of a stroke. And Bowers says they were all getting ready to packing up to go down to do another camping trip down on the Ventura County coast. And she died suddenly when she was getting ready to go on that trip. And so Bowers then, he left Santa Barbara. By then, he was no longer pastor at the church. He kind of had, he still, I think, was preaching as a guest preacher from time to time, but he really changed profession. He thought he was going to, I think, make archaeology his profession. But after his wife's death, he moved back to Wisconsin, and he entered the newspaper publishing business. He started a couple newspapers back there, one right after another. And during that time, he remarried to his second wife, Margaret Dixon. But he didn't really make a go of it with the newspapers. He also went to Nebraska, after Wisconsin. Didn't really make a go of it with the newspapers. And he moved back to Ventura, where he went into the newspaper business again. And he ended up, I think, publishing 4 different newspapers. He'd get them going, and then he would sell them for about an 11-year period in both Ventura and Santa Paula. In 1884, he still was dabbling in archaeology. And in 1884, he purchased a collection of artifacts that was found in a cave in the mountains near Santa Clarita. And today that cave is known as Bowers Cave, even though he didn't make the discovery. But he did publish a notice about the cave, describing its contents, and in a journal that he founded when he was back in California called the Pacific Science Monthly. And in fact, during this period of time, Bowers published a number of different articles. He published in Science Magazine, he published in other science journals about his research here in California. And in 1889, he went on out to San Nicolas Island on another expedition. And so this is what Ventura looked like about 1880 when Bowers moved there. There's the Mission Church at in Ventura. That's Main Street. And this is Bowers' home on the left. That's where he lived. And on the right is one of the papers that he owned was the Ventura Free Press. So his home was right next door to his newspaper business. And this is what the Free Press looked like inside. There's the printing press and some of the workers. And I'd like to especially point out one of the workers, this man here back in the shadows, because let's blow him up and take a closer look. Because this man here is Juan Isadora Pico. He's a Chumash man that Bowers had hired and who worked for Bowers in the Free Press office. Now, Bowers knew several Chumash Indians and interviewed them. For example, in 1877, when he published that article on Santa Rosa Island, he'd interviewed an elderly Indian man who was the last person living who had been born on Santa Rosa Island. And he mentions that in his article. I wish we had more notes from him about those interviews, though. Bowers also had quite the library, and he boasted that it was the largest one in Ventura County. Here's a picture of Bowers in his library in Ventura. Now, Bowers hadn't given up his ideas about religion, and he really was strongly involved in crusades against drinking. He was a prohibitionist, and here he is socializing with ladies at a Ventura picnic, and I suspect that this is the Women's Christian Temperance Union or something like that he's meeting with. He was no longer a practicing minister, but I think he would continue to give sermons from time to time at different churches, but he mainly got involved in politics and in newspaper publishing when he was down there in Ventura. And this is a photograph taken from his Santa Rosa Island expedition. You can see the island had been completely denuded of vegetation, or nearly denuded of vegetation. This is one of the sand dunes, and it exposed a lot of the artifacts and shells that had been in the dunes there. And this is all the abalone shells that you can see on the surface of this particular site. Bowers also started exploring and in the backcountry of Ventura County. And this is a map that he sketched and sent to the Smithsonian that shows a lot of interesting features on it. And wherever you see a red arrow, there's either an Indian village site or there's a mine, because Bowers was very interested in mines and geology as well as archaeology. So this is showing the Santa Clara River and Piru Creek and the Santa Paula area. These are places he noted. One of these, this one up here, he shows is a hieroglyphic cave. So these would be Chumash rock paintings at that location there. Now, I mentioned about the cave where the artifacts were found near Santa Clarita. And this is a photograph taken of that collection. It was shipped to this, he sold it to the Peabody Museum. He purchased it from the farm boys who found it, and then he purchased the entire collection and then sold it to the Peabody Museum at Harvard University. And this is the old exhibit that they had there. And you can see it's really an amazing collection. There were 40 deer tibia whistles. There were 9 baskets, I think. There were also feathered banners. It was a ceremonial cache of the native people who lived in that area. They're very similar to what Chumash Indians were using, but it was in the territory that was inhabited by Tataviam people. They were inland neighbors of the Chumash. And these are photographs that I took back at the Peabody Museum, Harvard. These are examples of some of those deer tibia whistles. And what's amazing is that they were stored in a dry cave, so they were preserved. They were, you could see that these whistles have wrapping, a juncus wrapping around them, and they're decorated with asphaltum designs. And as I said, there were 40 of these in that particular cache. There were also bull roarers that were also used in ceremonies. These are painted, and these are some of the ones that were found in Bowers Cave. And then there were these ceremonial staffs as well, which are also painted and also mounted on a stick and held in place with asphaltum. And we know that sticks like this were used in winter solstice ceremonies. Okay, well, Bowers eventually gave up his newspaper and moved to Fallbrook, San Diego County, moved away from Ventura, and started a newspaper there in Fallbrook, but that one didn't last very long either. And then he sold that and then moved to Los Angeles, and where he became the editor of a prohibitionist paper called the California Voice. Bowers was very outspoken in his views about various things, and he was, I would say, he was a prejudiced person. He was anti-Semitic. He was also made some statements that we would regard today as well, that were racist from today's perspective. And he, as a result, though, even for his time, some of the statements that he made were outrageous. And so he was expelled from the Methodist Ministers Union in 1896. But a few years later, he was appointed then, because of his geological expertise, he was appointed as the state mine examiner. And he also served as a geologist with the U.S. Geological Survey, had an official appointment with them. And he did geological surveys out in the California desert and down into Mexico. And in 1904, he joined with some others to incorporate a mining venture there in Sonora, Mexico. But he continued to do his preaching, and he would go to the pulpit. Even some of the Methodists would still let him preach in their church, but he also joined the Nazarene Church. And then in 1907, he passed away there in Los Angeles. So when he died, here's an article from the Los Angeles Herald, January 6, 1907, saying great geologists passed away. And the whole article is about Bowers and his scientific contributions. So what are those contributions? What can we say about Bowers today from the standpoint of the 21st century? Well, we know that he left us some well-drawn field maps that show features at these Chumash village sites that today are no longer visible. And so they help interpret what a layout of a Chumash village may have been like or was like. And in his collections that are extant at museums like the Harvard and Yale and American Museum of Natural History and the Smithsonian Institution especially, the presence of certain rare artifact types, sometimes in considerable quantity, pose new questions about the function and distribution that will aid in, I think, future research. So you can still go back to these I'd say legacy collections from Bowers and still learn new things. And so I think that's one of the contributions of his work. Also, because he did keep those journals, and we have his shipping records and the catalog records from these early, from the time period in which he worked, we can reconstruct some of the provenience information for these artifacts and collections. And so that's also helpful in looking at some of the questions that archaeologists ask today about trade among villages and so on. And besides his archaeological work, Bowers was a pretty good geologist and paleontologist. And a number of fossils are named after him, including this one. This is from one of his photographs. This was an ammonite, Ammonites bowersii, that was displayed in his front yard of his Los Angeles home. So in conclusion, I'm going to quote from an article that was published about Bowers in the Ventura County Historical Society Quarterly back in 1958. And we would be well advised not to arrive at too hasty an opinion of Stephen Bowers. He's regarded by some scientists as a crackpot and a farce, and yet the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. thinks highly of his work. The differing opinions are typical of the man. His notes on the geology of Ventura County is considered by modern authorities as excellent for its early period of publication. And so that concludes my talk about this kind of complex and controversial character that was Stephen Bowers. And I'd be happy to answer anybody's questions. Thank you.
All right, thank you, John. That was awesome. You can stop share if you want. And we do have a lot of questions for you, so this is awesome. We'll jump right in here. Stefan asks, John, could you explain the difference between antiquarians in the 19th century and modern archaeology?
Yes, well, Bowers would be one of those we refer to as an antiquarian. He was mainly interested in the objects themselves, and he wanted good objects that would illustrate the culture of the people, and that we'd be good for public display. So that's why he was gathering these. He viewed it as his patriotic duty, to get collections into the Smithsonian. Today, of course, we're interested more in many questions about reconstructing the past lifeways of the people, how they were interacting with each other villages, in trade and exchange and so on. And we're interested so we keep very detailed records about, what is found, where it comes from precisely. That's why we have these, we make maps, we excavate in pits, we excavate we look at the stratigraphy of the site, excavating in different depth intervals, in order to gather the information that we can use to study, we can study the layout of a village and know where which artifacts were found where in the village, so we can reconstruct activity areas within the village. We can also look at change through time, and why did cultures change over time? And that's why we keep very detailed records about the depth that things are found and so on. So there's a world of difference in the archaeology being practiced today. We also use screens. There's no evidence that Bowers was using screens back in the 1870s. He was just going after the big things. And we don't focus on cemeteries today, in our excavations.
That all makes sense. All right, great, thank you. This one is from Chris. He says, I know that we are only seeing a small amount of the total artifacts, but these points all look to be very large and very old. Can you elaborate on this?
Well, the photographs that I showed of the knives, those were not those were knives used like we use knives. And now I also showed a few. I didn't show very many of arrow points in there, but of course, um, uh, those are also present in the Bowers collection. Although, like I said, he wasn't screening, so he was probably missing a lot of the smaller sized items during his excavations. And he, so yeah, I think that those knives are very interesting. We look at them with regard to where they're coming from. So obviously that obsidian knife with the serrated edges, that was very unique. Probably wasn't a day-to-day implement. It's probably it was a special piece that was owned by that individual, and probably came from far away. Most likely from, originally one of the obsidian flows and quarries that were over there near Death Valley, and in the Coso Range, for example. So that had been imported a great distance. The two knives that I showed when I mentioned the very first artifact that we know he found, were those, we can tell from the material that was used, those were from the formation in the Carrizo Plain. So if they were found here along the coast, they had been imported all the way over several ranges of mountains in order to get to the Santa Barbara Channel coast. So the materials that those knives are made out of are telling us something about exchange systems and procurement and things like that.
Wow, thank you. This one's a really good question. Do you know exactly where Bowers lived in Ventura, and is his house still there by chance?
Personally, I don't know where he lived, but I think records exist that could establish that location. The Ventura County, or the Museum of Ventura County, there has a research library, and they have all the early maps of that show the different property ownerships in the city of Ventura, and I'm sure we could kind of track down and figure out, where Bowers living. He moved from place to place. You probably realize he was going to different ministries, different cities. You go back to the Midwest, back to California, back to the Midwest, back to California. And then he lived all over, Santa Barbara, Ventura, down in Fallbrook, Los Angeles, and so on. So he moved around quite a bit.
That's true. Well, if anyone finds it, email John Johnson and let us know.
Thank you.
All right, this one is from Dennis. Is there any relation between Stefan Bowers and the Bowers Museum in Santa Ana?
That's a good question. I wondered that myself, because I grew up in Orange County and I knew about the Bowers Museum. And I used to attend meetings that there were Archaeological Society that were held at the Bowers Museum, but it's a different Bowers. It's not related to Stephen Bowers. That's named after someone named Charles Bowers. And I don't know a lot about him, but I don't believe he's a relative of Stephen Bowers.
Got it. This one is from Betsy. Was Bowers more or less methodical than his contemporary archaeologists?
Good question. Yeah, was Bowers more or less methodical? Well, his contemporary, he's the only one that we have journals from. Of those four men that I described in that slide, he's the only one for whom we have journals with detailed maps and detailed descriptions of exactly where he went. That being said, Schumacher, the Hungarian archaeologist that was here, Schumacher also made very good maps, but we don't have his original field notes or journals. We only have correspondence that he has that were sent to museums in the East, and we have his couple of his publications where he has published some very good maps in those publications. So Schumacher also did good maps. We don't have any really field notes from Lorenzo Yates. He wasn't doing a lot of, well, he did have an archaeological collection, some of which is at our museum, actually, Lorenzo Yates. But also his shell collections are at our museum. But we don't have any archaeological journals from Lorenzo Yates. And Leon de Cizoc's papers and journals have all been lost. So there's no extant. We just have a narrative that he produced when he went back to France of what he'd done. But it is not the same category as from Stephen Bowers. So what's great about Stephen Bowers is he did keep those journals. They've been preserved down to the present day, and they include some nice maps in them as well.
Got it. Thank you. This one is from Chris. Are any of these collections back east displayed for the public to see, or are they all kind of buried behind the scenes? And is there any hope of bringing anything back here, back west?
Well, that's kind of two questions there.
Yeah.
I think, some of the collections from Stephen Bowers are on exhibit. I haven't been to the exhibits at the National Museum of Natural History recently to see what might be on exhibit, but they used to have some of his things on exhibit. And the Peabody Museum, Harvard, also displayed some things that came from Stephen Bowers. But, like any museum, you can only show a fraction of the material that you have. So some of these are in their collections for, they can be used for research and so on, and or for, to be rotated on and off exhibit. So they do have some things that they exhibit, but all museums have more than what they could possibly put on display.
Yeah. And are there any back west?
Pardon?
Are there any of his Bowers on the West Coast, or his collections? Where are them? Are they over here?
Yeah, well, I'm sure that we would be able to borrow collections from one of those East Coast museums if we had a special purpose to do, to use particular artifacts in exhibits. Also, I know that the San Ynez tribe is building their own museum cultural center over there at the reservation. And they've also been back to the Smithsonian and talked about pieces maybe they could be exhibited there at San Ynez. And with regard to, we actually have some collections from Stephen Bowers, not many of the spectacular pieces that I was showing in my talk, but his great grandson, when the journals were donated to our museum, and the drawings and photographs and so on, and Bowers' personal papers, when those are donated to our museum, they also came with several trays worth of artifacts as well. Unfortunately, Bowers' grandson had a lot of Bowers collections that he still retained in a garage, and that garage caught fire and burned up a lot of material. So some of the things that we got from Bowers' great-grandson have smoke damage and burn marks on them and so on, because they survived the fire.
So there we go. We do have some.
We do have some.
So we have time for a few more questions. Was archaeology considered a paid profession during Bowers' time?
Well, not really. It was the way you made your money as an archaeologist in his day was to, sell the collections that you obtain. And he tried to make a go of it. When he quit being a minister in 1877 for the Methodist Church here in Santa Barbara, he tried to make a go of it for a few years until his wife died, as an archaeologist, selling the material to the Smithsonian and to other museums. And he continued to earn money that way, even when he was down in Ventura, of course, with the Bowers Cave collection and so on. But Schumacher was the same way. you know, he was all the time writing, asking to be sort of sent some money so then he could go and continue his archaeological work, you know, for the Smithsonian or for the Peabody Museum in Harvard. Leon de Selac ran into trouble too, and ran out of money, and eventually just abandoned archaeology altogether when she got back to France. And Lorenzo Yates was a dentist, so he didn't need to use archaeology as to make money.
Cool. We have an update. This is from Craig. He's saying, FYI, Bauer's home in Ventura was located at the corner of Oak and Santa Clara Street, but unfortunately it is no longer there. So thank you, Craig, for answering that question.
Thank you for that. Yeah.
And here's another one from Craig. So thank you, Craig. He believes that some of Bauer's library has been donated to USC along with some artifacts. And he's wondering, have you had the opportunity to go there or access any of these items?
No, I don't even know about that. So I'm learning from Craig here today. Yeah. Yeah, Craig, I'd like to follow up on that. That's very interesting. I don't know about things that may have ended up at USC.
Okay, it sounds like you guys need to email. This one is from Annette. She says that she's curious about the slides of artifacts at the Peabody Museum. Is it possible the picture with the leaf carving is fossilized? Is there much paleo info from that area?
Well, actually that, no, that's obviously made by human hands.
Oh, okay.
That's not a fossil that's on the that particular bead. It was just very unique. I've never seen anything like it. But it's one of the good things about Bauer's collection is this is before people were really faking artifacts, in those at that particular period of time. So I think we can be confident that that was an original Chumash manufacture. Yeah.
Here we go. This last question, thank you, John, is from Roseanne, and she's just wondering if this session will be available for those who might have missed it, and that is a great question, Roseanne. In about a few weeks, we take every science pub and upload them to the museum's YouTube page. So you can check out our YouTube page and see any of the virtual science pubs that you might have missed. So that is it for tonight. Thank you, John, and thank all of you for joining us. We will see you on July 12th for our next Science Pub from Home, Reef Building Corals and the Response to Environmental Stress. Until then, take care, and we hope to see you at the Museum and Sea Center soon. Have a good night. Thank you, John.
Thank you.